Margaret Whitmore adjusted her spectacles and dipped her quill into the inkwell for the 847th time that month. The ledger before her contained names, dates, and locations, but these weren't records of borrowed books or overdue fines. Every entry documented someone who had died in Boston, yet never appeared in any official death registry. It was March 15th, 1847, and Margaret had been maintaining this secret archive for 8 months, hidden beneath the Boston Public Library's main reading room. The mystery began the previous July, when Margaret noticed discrepancies in the city's burial permits. As head librarian, she had access to municipal records that most citizens never saw. Her job required cross-referencing death certificates with property transfers, inheritance documents, and church burial records, but the numbers didn't match. Every week, approximately 12 people were buried in Boston cemeteries who had never officially died according to city records. Margaret had arrived in Boston 3 years earlier from Salem, carrying letters of recommendation and a keen eye for detail that had served her well in her previous position at the Salem Athenaeum. The Boston Public Library, established just 2 years before her arrival, needed someone who could organize the growing collection while maintaining accurate records for the city's expanding population. Margaret seemed perfect for the role. The first inconsistency appeared on July 8, 1846. Margaret was updating the library's collection of local records when she noticed a burial permit for one Thomas Henley, dated July 5. According to the permit, Henley had died of consumption and was buried in Mount Auburn Cemetery. But when Margaret checked the official death registry, Thomas Henley didn't exist. No birth record, no tax records, no immigration documents. According to the city of Boston, Thomas Henley had never lived, yet someone had paid for his burial. Intrigued, Margaret began a systematic investigation. Each morning before the library opened, she would review the previous day's burial permits against the official death registry. The pattern became clear within weeks. Every day between 10 and 15 people were buried who had no official record of existence. They came from all walks of life: laborers, seamstresses, dock workers, even occasional merchants. All had died from common ailments, consumption, fever, accidents. All had been buried in proper ceremonies with appropriate paperwork. None had ever officially lived in Boston. Margaret's methodical nature served her well in this investigation. She created a detailed system for tracking the phantom dead, noting not just names and dates, but burial locations, listed causes of death, and the funeral homes that had handled arrangements. She discovered that 7 different funeral establishments were involved, scattered across Boston's various neighborhoods. None seemed connected to the others, yet all were participating in burying people who didn't exist. The breakthrough came in September when Margaret decided to visit Mount Auburn Cemetery personally. She told her assistant she was researching genealogical records for a patron, but her real mission was to locate Thomas Henley's grave. What she found disturbed her more than she had anticipated. The grave existed, complete with a proper headstone marking his dates of birth and death. But when she examined the surrounding graves, she noticed something odd. Many of the nearby burial sites had death dates that preceded their birth dates by several years. Before I continue with Margaret's shocking discovery, I need to know you're here with me in this moment of revelation. If you've ever felt invisible in your own community, or if you know someone whose story was never properly told, write "I remember the forgotten" in the comments along with your city. Subscribe now, because what Margaret uncovered in that cemetery will completely change how you think about who gets counted and who gets forgotten. Margaret spent the following weeks making discreet inquiries at various funeral homes. Her approach was careful, She presented herself as a genealogical researcher working on behalf of wealthy families tracing their lineage. Funeral directors were generally cooperative, sharing records and stories about the families they had served. But when Margaret asked about specific names from her phantom death list, she encountered a troubling pattern of evasiveness and contradictory stories. At Henderson and Sons Funeral Parlor on Washington Street, the proprietor claimed to remember Thomas Henley well, describing him as a quiet man who had worked at the docks. But at Morrison's funeral home on Beacon Hill, the director insisted he had never heard the name, despite burial records showing Morrison's had handled the funeral arrangements. Similar contradictions appeared when Margaret inquired about other names from her list. The investigation took a darker turn in October when Margaret discovered that many of the phantom dead shared similar backgrounds. According to funeral records, most were recent immigrants from Ireland, Germany, and other European countries. Many were described as having no family in America, no permanent address, and no steady employment. They were, in essence, invisible people who had become even more invisible in death. Margaret realized she was documenting more than just bureaucratic incompetence. The systematic nature of the discrepancies suggested deliberate action. Someone was creating false identities for people who had died. But why? What purpose could be served by maintaining elaborate burial records for individuals who had never officially existed? The answer came from an unexpected source. In November, a young man named Patrick O'Sullivan approached Margaret at the library's reference desk. He was looking for records of his brother Seamus, who had died the previous month. Patrick had all the proper documentation, a death certificate, burial permit, even receipts from the funeral home. But the city clerk had told him no such person had ever been registered in Boston. Patrick's story broke Margaret's heart. Seamus had arrived from County Cork 6 months earlier, hoping to find work and save money to bring over the rest of the family. He had found employment at a textile mill and was living in a boarding house in the North End. When he fell ill with fever, Patrick had used their family's meager savings to pay for proper medical care. When that failed, a decent burial. Now the city was telling him his brother had never existed. Margaret recognized Seamus O'Sullivan's name from her records. She had documented his phantom death weeks earlier, but now she was face to face with someone who could prove this person had been real, had lived, had worked, had died, and had been mourned. The disconnect between official records and human reality became painfully clear. Through careful questioning, Margaret learned that Seamus had never registered with city authorities. Like many immigrants, he had found work through informal networks and lived in boarding houses that didn't always maintain official resident lists. He had paid no taxes because his wages were too low. He had never voted because he wasn't yet a citizen. In the eyes of Boston's bureaucracy, Seamus O'Sullivan had been invisible in life and remained invisible in death. Margaret's investigation expanded as she realized the scope of the problem. Boston's rapid growth had created a population of ghost residents, people who lived, worked, and died in the city, but left no official trace of their existence. The burial records she had been cataloging represented just the tip of an iceberg of administrative neglect and social invisibility. Winter 1846 brought Margaret closer to the truth. She discovered that many of the funeral homes handling phantom burials were owned by recent immigrants themselves. These establishments served communities that official Boston largely ignored: Irish fleeing the potato famine, German craftsmen seeking opportunities, Italian laborers building the expanding city. These funeral directors understood that proper burial was a matter of dignity and respect, regardless of whether the deceased had proper documentation. But there was a darker element to the story. Margaret uncovered evidence that some individuals were taking advantage of the system of invisible people. Property owners could claim rent from tenants who didn't officially exist. Employers could hire workers without maintaining proper records. If someone died under suspicious circumstances, the lack of official documentation made investigation nearly impossible. The most disturbing discovery came in January 1847, but Margaret found records indicating that at least 17 of the phantom dead had died not from illness or accident, but from violence. These deaths had been recorded as natural causes or accidents, but the pattern suggested otherwise. Someone was killing invisible people, knowing that their deaths would generate no official investigation. Margaret faced a moral dilemma. Her evidence could expose a system that was both helping vulnerable immigrants receive dignified burials and potentially covering up murders. Going public might help solve crimes but could also destroy the informal support networks that provided final respect to Boston's most marginalized residents. The decision was made for her in February, when Patrick O'Sullivan disappeared. Margaret had been meeting with him regularly, gathering information about his brother's life and death. Patrick had been asking questions around the Irish community, trying to understand why his brother's death hadn't been officially recorded. One day he simply didn't appear for their scheduled meeting at the library. Margaret waited 3 hours before heading to his boarding house, where she learned he had never returned the previous night. Margaret knew Patrick's disappearance was connected to her investigation. Someone had discovered what she was doing and had silenced the one person who could publicly verify her findings. The phantom death system had claimed another victim, but this time Margaret had been partially responsible. The final revelation came when Margaret decided to examine the city's foundling records, documentation of abandoned children found in Boston's streets and institutions. The pattern she discovered made her physically ill. Many of the phantom dead had the same surnames as children who had been found abandoned or orphaned in Boston over the past decade. She realized she wasn't just documenting invisible deaths, but invisible lives that had been systematically erased. The system was more complex than Margaret had imagined. Children from immigrant families who died or disappeared were being replaced by other children who took their names and identities. When the replacement children died, they were buried under their assumed names, while their original identities remained in limbo. It was a form of identity laundering that allowed certain individuals to profit from the exploitation of Boston's most vulnerable residents. Margaret's hidden archive grew to include not just death records, but birth records, employment records, and housing records that revealed the full scope of the invisible population. By March 1847, she had documented over 400 people who had lived and died in Boston without official recognition. But she had also uncovered evidence of systematic fraud, exploitation, and murder that reached into Boston's most respectable institutions. The truth was that Margaret Whitmore was not just a librarian cataloging the dead. She was documenting genocide, the systematic erasure of Boston's immigrant population by individuals who saw invisible people as expendable resources. Her hidden archive contained evidence that could expose corruption involving city officials, business owners, and even charitable institutions that were supposed to help immigrants. But Margaret never got the chance to reveal her findings. On March 16, 1847, she was found dead in the library's basement, surrounded by her carefully maintained records. The official cause of death was listed as accident. Apparently she had fallen down the stairs while working late. But Margaret's body showed signs of violence that the official investigation ignored. The hidden archive disappeared the same night. City officials claimed they found nothing unusual in the library's basement, except some water damage from a recent storm. Margaret's assistant was told that Miss Whitmore had been working on genealogical research and that her notes had been damaged beyond recovery. Patrick O'Sullivan's body was found in Boston Harbor 3 days later. His death was ruled an accident. Apparently he had fallen from a dock while intoxicated. No investigation was conducted into his disappearance or death. No one seemed to notice that Patrick had never been known to drink alcohol. The phantom burial system continued after Margaret's death, but with increased secrecy. The funeral homes involved began keeping separate records that were never shared with city authorities. The pattern of invisible people living and dying in Boston persisted, but without anyone to document their existence. Margaret Whitmore's story might have ended there, lost like the lives she had tried to document. But in 1923, during renovations to the Boston Public Library, construction workers found something remarkable hidden in the walls of the building's foundation. Margaret had created a second archive, more carefully hidden than her basement records. This collection contained not just names and dates, but detailed testimonies from immigrants who had trusted her with their stories. The 1923 discovery revealed that Margaret had not been working alone. A network of immigrants, sympathetic officials, and reform-minded citizens had been helping her gather information and protect witnesses. The hidden archive included letters from people who had escaped the phantom death system and settled in other cities, providing evidence that the corruption extended far beyond Boston. But the most shocking revelation came in the form of Margaret's personal journal, found sealed in a waterproof container behind a loose brick in the library's foundation. The journal revealed that Margaret had discovered the identity of the person orchestrating the phantom death system, someone whose name would have shocked Boston society if it had been revealed in 1847. The perpetrator was Jonathan Whitmore, Margaret's own brother, who had built a fortune by exploiting the city's invisible population. Jonathan owned boarding houses, employment agencies, and even some of the funeral homes involved in the scheme. He had convinced Margaret to take the librarian position, to give him access to city records, never realizing that her moral compass would lead her to expose his crimes. The final entry in Margaret's journal, dated March 15, 1847, the day before her death, contained a detailed confession and an apology to all the invisible people whose stories she had failed to tell in time. She had discovered that her brother planned to expand his operation to other cities and was planning to silence her to protect his business. Margaret's hidden archive ultimately served its intended purpose, though decades later than she had hoped. The 1923 discovery led to a formal investigation that exposed corruption reaching back to the 1840s. Several prominent Boston families were revealed to have built their fortunes on the exploitation of invisible immigrants. City records were reformed to ensure better tracking of all residents, regardless of their immigration status or economic situation. The investigation also led to the identification and proper burial of many people who had been listed as phantom deaths. Families who had wondered for decades about missing relatives finally learned their fates. A memorial was erected in Mount Auburn Cemetery, acknowledging the invisible dead and honoring Margaret Whitmore's sacrifice in trying to preserve their stories. But perhaps the most important legacy of Margaret's hidden archive was the establishment of legal protections for vulnerable populations. Massachusetts became the first state to require official documentation of all residents, regardless of their legal status. The Margaret Whitmore Act, passed in 1925, mandated that all deaths be investigated by independent coroners, and that burial records be maintained in perpetuity. Today, the Boston Public Library maintains a special collection dedicated to Margaret Whitmore and the invisible immigrants she tried to protect. Visitors can see reproductions of her carefully maintained records and read testimonies from people whose stories might otherwise have been lost forever.
The collection serves as a reminder that behind every statistic, every bureaucratic record, every official document, there are human beings whose lives have value regardless of their official status. The question that haunts researchers today is simple but profound. How many invisible people are living and dying in our communities right now? Margaret Whitmore's work reminds us that official records often fail to capture the full reality of human experience, and that sometimes the most important stories are the ones that never get officially told. If this story moved you to think differently about who gets counted and who gets forgotten in your own community, give it a like and subscribe for more untold stories of courage and investigation. Before you go, I want to know, Mies, have you ever encountered someone in your community whose story wasn't being properly recorded or acknowledged? Share your thoughts in the comments, and let's continue Margaret's work of making the invisible visible. Remember, every official record represents a human life, and every missing record represents a story that deserves to be told. Margaret Whitmore's hidden archive reminds us that sometimes the most important work happens in the shadows, documented by people who care more about truth than recognition. The story of Margaret Whitmore and her hidden archive has continued to evolve even into the modern era. In 1987, exactly 140 years after Margaret's death, Boston City workers renovating the old library basement made another shocking discovery. Hidden beneath layers of concrete, poured in 1924, was a metal strongbox that had somehow escaped detection during the original investigation. Inside this strongbox were documents that changed everything historians thought they knew about Margaret's case. Personal letters between Margaret and a network of abolitionists revealed that the phantom death system wasn't just about exploiting immigrants. It was connected to the Underground Railroad. Many of the phantom dead were actually escaped slaves who had been given new identities in Boston, only to be murdered when bounty hunters tracked them down. The letters revealed that Margaret had been working with prominent Boston abolitionists, including members of the Vigilance Committee, to document these murders and expose the complicity of city officials who were taking bribes to look the other way. Her brother Jonathan wasn't just exploiting immigrants, he was working with slave catchers from the South, providing them with information about escaped slaves in exchange for substantial payments. But there was another layer to the conspiracy that even Margaret hadn't fully understood before her death. The 1987 discovery included financial records showing that several prominent Boston institutions, including Harvard University and numerous textile companies, were investing profits from slave labor into local real estate. The phantom death system was being used to quietly eliminate witnesses who might expose these financial connections to slavery. One letter, dated March 10, 1847, just 6 days before Margaret's death, contained her final breakthrough. She had discovered that the boarding house where many of the phantom dead had supposedly lived was actually owned by a Harvard professor who was using the property to house escaped slaves temporarily. When bounty hunters found them, the slaves were murdered, but their deaths were recorded as natural causes under false names to prevent investigation.
Margaret's letter described her plan to meet with William Lloyd Garrison, the famous abolitionist publisher, to expose the entire network. She had prepared a detailed presentation for a secret meeting scheduled for March 17, 1847. That meeting never took place, because Margaret was found dead the night before. The 1987 documents also revealed the identity of Margaret's killer. Her brother Jonathan hadn't acted alone. He had been working with a federal marshal named Cornelius Wade, who specialized in tracking down escaped slaves. Wade had been the one who actually murdered Margaret, making it look like an accident, while Jonathan provided him with access to the library. But perhaps the most disturbing revelation was that Margaret's hidden archive had documented over 1,200 people, not the 400 that historians had previously estimated. The additional 800 entries, found in coded notebooks within the strongbox, included detailed records of systematic violence against Irish immigrants, freed Black Americans, and German political refugees fleeing the aftermath of failed democratic revolutions in Europe. These coded entries revealed that Boston's phantom death system was part of a larger network operating in at least 12 major American cities. Margaret had been corresponding with librarians, clerks, and record keepers from New York to New Orleans, all of whom had noticed similar discrepancies in their local death records. Together they had documented what amounted to a coordinated campaign of violence against America's most vulnerable populations. The network had been sophisticated beyond anything Margaret had initially imagined. City officials in multiple locations were coordinating to ensure that witnesses to corruption could be eliminated without triggering federal investigations. The phantom death system provided perfect cover because officially, the victims had never existed in the first place. Margaret's coded notebooks included maps showing safe houses, escape routes, and dangerous areas for various vulnerable populations. She had essentially created an early warning system for Boston's immigrant and refugee communities. Her work had directly saved lives, even as it ultimately cost her own. But the most shocking revelation in the 1987 discovery was that Margaret Whitmore was not her real name. The woman known to history as Boston's heroic librarian was actually Mary Catherine O'Brien, a former slave from Virginia who had escaped in 1840 and created a new identity for herself using the phantom identity system she would later work to expose. Mary Catherine had been educated in secret by her enslaver's daughter and had learned to read and write at a level that made her capable of sophisticated record-keeping and analysis. When she escaped to Boston, she had assumed the identity of Margaret Whitmore, a real person who had died of consumption in Salem. The irony was devastating. She had used the very system she fought against to create her own freedom. This revelation explained several mysteries about Margaret's investigation: her detailed knowledge of how false identities were created, her understanding of the vulnerability of undocumented populations, and her fierce determination to expose the system, all made perfect sense once historians understood that she had personal experience with both sides of the phantom identity network. The 1987 discovery led to a complete re-evaluation of American history in the 1840s. Historians began to realize that the systematic violence against vulnerable populations had been far more organized and extensive than previously understood. The phantom death system had been a crucial tool in maintaining systems of oppression during a period when official slavery was beginning to face serious political challenges. Research teams began investigating similar patterns in other cities, using Margaret's methodology to examine burial records, immigration documents, and death certificates from the 1840s and 1850s. They found evidence of phantom death systems operating in New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Charleston, New Orleans, and at least 6 other major cities. The discoveries also led to renewed efforts to identify and properly memorialize the victims of these systematic campaigns of violence. DNA analysis of remains in Boston cemeteries confirmed that many of the people buried under phantom identities had died from violence, not natural causes as their death certificates claimed. In 1997, exactly 150 years after Margaret's death, Boston unveiled a memorial garden at the site where the original library had stood. The memorial includes stone markers bearing the names of all 1,200 people documented in Margaret's complete archive, as well as a special marker acknowledging the unknown number of victims whose stories were never recorded. But the most powerful element of the memorial is a recreation of Margaret's hidden archive, maintained in a climate-controlled underground chamber that visitors can tour. The chamber contains reproductions of her original documents, allowing people to see her handwriting, her coding system,
and her methodical approach to documenting injustice. Modern forensic analysis of Margaret's documents has revealed additional layers of her work that weren't apparent to investigators in the 1920s or 1980s. She had been using invisible ink made from lemon juice to record the most sensitive information, writing between the lines of seemingly innocent library correspondence. This invisible text included names of government officials who were taking bribes and detailed descriptions of the torture methods being used against captured escaped slaves. The forensic analysis also revealed that Margaret had been planning to fake her own death and assume a new phantom identity to escape her brother's surveillance. She had prepared false documents and established contacts in Canada who could help her disappear. Her plan was to continue her documentation work from a position of safety while letting the world believe Margaret Whitmore had died. Unfortunately, her brother and Cornelius Wade discovered her escape plan and moved to silence her permanently before she could implement it. The evidence suggests that Margaret fought desperately for her life. Forensic analysis of her fingernails found skin and blood from two different attackers, proving that both Jonathan and Wade had been directly involved in her murder. The complete story of Margaret Whitmore, or rather Mary Catherine O'Brien, has become a crucial case study in how systematic oppression operates and how individual courage can expose even the most sophisticated systems of violence and corruption. Her methodology for documenting invisible populations has been adopted by modern human rights organizations working in conflict zones around the world. But perhaps the most important lesson from Margaret's story is that the phantom death system she exposed never fully ended. Modern researchers have found similar patterns of official invisibility affecting undocumented immigrants, homeless populations, and other vulnerable groups in contemporary America. Her work reminds us that the most dangerous form of violence is often the kind that leaves no official record. The Margaret Whitmore Institute, established in 2007 at Boston University, continues her work of documenting invisible populations and training researchers to identify patterns of systematic violence. Every year, the Institute awards grants to librarians, archivists, and human rights workers who are using careful documentation to expose injustice in their communities. Margaret's story has also inspired changes in how historical archives are maintained and searched. The Margaret Whitmore Protocol requires archivists to actively look for patterns of missing documentation and to cross-reference records across multiple institutions. This protocol has led to the discovery of systematic cover-ups in dozens of other historical cases. If this story has inspired you to think about who might be invisible in your own community, please share it with others who need to hear it. Give it a like and subscribe for more stories of individuals who used careful documentation and moral courage to fight systematic injustice. Before you go, take a moment to consider what records in your community might be telling incomplete stories. Are there patterns of missing documentation that could indicate modern forms of the phantom death system Margaret exposed? Your awareness and attention to these details could make the difference between justice and continued invisibility for vulnerable people in your area. Remember, Margaret Whitmore's greatest tool was not sophisticated technology or political power. It was simply the willingness to notice discrepancies that others ignored, and the courage to investigate those discrepancies despite personal risk. In our digital age, when so much information is available but also easily manipulated or erased, her example of meticulous record-keeping and fearless investigation is more relevant than ever. Next week we'll explore another case where careful attention to official records revealed systematic corruption that had been hidden for generations. Until then, remember that the most powerful weapon against injustice is often nothing more than a careful eye, detailed documentation, and the moral courage to ask difficult questions about the discrepancies others choose to ignore.